Today's AskReddit post, Psychologists of Reddit. What's one thing a patient has told you that caught you off guard? Or vice versa. Patient's perspective? Oh boy, this is gonna be a good one. Let's get started. My therapist once abruptly ended our session after telling me I needed to go to the ER. I had been in a car accident the day before and had an undiagnosed concussion that was pretty bad. I was so out of it I didn't even realize I was out of it. He later told me I was talking about inappropriate topics. I was so embarrassed I didn't ask what I specifically talked about. I didn't want to know at that point, and wasn't making much sense. I'm just glad he recognized I was off that day and helped me get to the hospital. Told mine I had seen him grabbing a drink at the same place I used to go get drunk before COVID. He stared at me like I had discovered something NASA was hiding. We had a laugh and he confessed it. Context: I had huge drinking problems and he told me he didn't like to drink at all. That's actually pretty funny. It is. After that things got way easier for me, and he inspired me to become a shrink myself after this crazy time's end. At the rehab I went to, I had an absolutely amazing therapist. Dude had been through trauma as a kid and was married religious with kids when he realized he was gay. He and wife divorced amicably. Point being, he had been through a lot of life. He had an amazing therapist who really helped him come to terms with a few things. He decided he would become a therapist himself. 10 years later, to the day, he graduated as a licensed therapist. He really made an impact on me. He practiced EMDR and just had a lovely understanding of people and the world. My favorite thing he used to say went along the lines of people make the best decisions they can at the time, with the knowledge they have. Reminds me that all my duck ups and mistakes don't have to be constant sources of shame. He did it, you can too. I have used that quote to come to terms with a lot of the decisions my parents made when I was a kid. I paid and sat through an entire session of therapy during which my therapist ranted as to how great of a career he could have had as a stand-up comedian and how much he regrets his current profession. I kinda agreed with him near the end. Except, it wasn't funny. Well, that's kinda funny. Maybe it was just a bit he was trying out. During my first and only session with a particularly memorable child psychologist, he referred to me as a miserable bitch. It was true, but he didn't have to call me out like that. Context: I work a lot from an existential perspective. At this time I was working at a jail and talking to a guy who hitches rides on trains. We were talking about what he would have to do to change his life, to not just get high and ride trains. He looked me square in the eyes and told me he's freer than anyone else he comes across. He isn't indebted to a 40+ hour work week, bills, or debts. He just hangs out with friends and travels state to state. He articulated how he knows he'll die young from missing a jump, but that ultimately he'll have lived and died as he wanted to. It was a conversation that really forced me to be cognizant of human freedom and choice. He wasn't disordered. He had chosen his own path and conclusion. The only thing he was doing wrong was breaking the status quo, the law. Frankly, who am I to judge or decide how to live a life? From then on, I was more careful to never tell a patient how to live or what to do. I'm only here to help someone think through their life and pick their desired direction. I have come to use a lot of sophist techniques to get patients to their own eureka moments. Edit: had a brain fart. I meant Socratic, not sophist. I think this illustrates what most people don't realize, and that's that as therapists, we learn from our clients as well. I learn something from every person I see. There's a very real sense of the perspective I formed during my adolescence is correct, and my higher education only bolsters that I get from a lot of people. We all of us should be constantly evolving our view of the world. I was in my second ever session, which coincidentally was right after my nan's funeral. I was talking about some stuff that had happened with my sister, who I had already said was probably my biggest issue, and he asked, why is this person in your life? Why do you want to continue a relationship that hurts you so much? Do you actually want this relationship? I was floored. It had never occurred to me that my sister didn't get a place in my life by default because family. I can tell you how much this improved my life. Left both my mother and her reincarnate. My sister. Behind years ago. Can't express how much better my life is without them in it. Rotten is rotten. Sometimes it's hard to imagine people, especially our own blood, not being good people. But as my father put it bluntly, not all lives are created equal. Referring to how some people are indeed simply rotten from the start and unredeemable. Well said. Unfortunately, I lost my relationship with the purest of people, my father. Through this, everyone made choices. No regrets. Your father was very wise. When I was in high school, I was hospitalized for being suicidal. My doctor there told me some really brilliant advice that totally cleared things up for me. Basically just fixing me on the spot. You just have to be a normal boy. LOL. And to think that he gets paid for that poop. Big bucks. 2. He was the head honcho. LOL. Seeing him hang up a corded telephone was a trip. Bye. Bye 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 bye. Bye. Bye as he moves both his head and his hand towards the place where you hang it up. His head was basically touching the base of the phone when he was done. Then he pops back up. LOL. Any chance he was Irish? The year I lived there they all hung up the phone saying bye like that. We watched a man talk himself into his coat pocket hanging up his cell phone. Nearly 20 years later we still joke about it. In fact, typing this in on my phone, the suggestion for bye is buy a better knife from us using it. I had one tell me I needed to learn to bite the bullet, which turned out to be good advice, even if it was blunt. Edit. I wasn't there because I was suicidal or anything. I was there because my mom and I had a pretty volatile relationship. She had some emotional issues where she'd just lash out at me over things that didn't make sense. And if I needed to learn to stick it out until she got better, which she eventually did, and we have a much better relationship, really paid off. Sometimes poop happens and truly the only way to get through it is by moving forward. As you said, it can be blunt, but it is the reality sometimes. I think the issue is the implied suicidal connotation if I'm not incorrect. Bite the bullet was a phrase made during the time in history that we made our bullets out of lead, which is very soft. If a soldier needed a medical treatment, amputation, they would put a lead bullet in their mouth to bite down on to distract from the pain. Think of it as an extreme stress ball. It doesn't mean to shoot oneself. I have a mini bullet from the Civil War with bite marks in it. I did most of my training in a pediatric hospital. One of my patients, young adult, with relapsing leukemia, cancer since young childhood, wanted to go to an outdoor festival with their significant other. The oncologists were adamant that due to the patient's low white blood count and current course of treatment, they shouldn't let them go. Basically, if that person caught an infection it would kill them. The patient was pissed, understandably so, and said something like, "I've had this disease since I was a child. I know I'm going to die soon. I'm going to the concert whether you like it or not, and if I die, then at least I'll do it on my own terms." It's always quite moving when a young person expresses their own mortality and confronts it head on. I had such admiration for that person. And they are right. Why suffer just to live longer? The patient could wear a mask and be very careful, but should still have fun and live. Yeah, what is the point of surviving if you have nothing to live for? Life for the sake of life is just torture. I had a therapist tell me when I was a teenager that she didn't know what else to do to help me because it seemed like I already understood everything pretty well. This was after my overbearing and crazy helicopter mom dragged me in for being depressed. Then she switched to therapy eyeing my mom, and my mom quickly was in tears because she has the emotional strength of a child and wanted it to be about me when it was actually all about her. I knew exactly why I was depressed. I was stuck by myself in the middle of nowhere with her crazy ass. No personal space. No ability to get away. Not being able to say no. Her getting jealous of my friends when I spent time with them. It would make anyone depressed. She didn't even let me sit with the therapist by myself. My mom did this and would change my doctors because they wouldn't tell her what we talked about in sessions. Then she found one who put me on all sorts of meds for depression, anxiety, and sleep. She is completely dependent and has turned into an ever bigger mess. When I was in 1st or 2nd grade, the school counselor fell asleep when I was describing a bullying situation that I was in. I was so young that I didn't know how to respond, so I just sat there in his office until he woke up. That's ducking horrible. Did you ever say anything? It's beautiful. Had a therapist tell me to make a duck budget. Hear me out, lol. He said you only have so many ducks to give before you blow. So just like with money, you need to budget it out. Start with things you have to give a duck about. Kids, work, health, and then cross the things you dislike giving a duck about. Like people's opinion of what you wear. Off the list, and don't give a duck about that poop. This was an older gentleman who was cool but for the most part very well spoken and didn't cuss. Hearing him say I needed to stop spreading my ducks so far made me die of laughter and immediately feel better. To this day I still have a duck budget that I do every month religiously, and it has taken so much stress off my shoulders. This is one of the greatest things I have ever heard. After 5 or 6 sessions I was about to schedule my next appointment when my therapist said she wouldn't continue seeing me because she should spend her time on patients who have real problems. I didn't see another therapist again for, like, 15 years. I'm curious. How old were you then? I had a similar experience when I was 14. The psychologist told me she needed me to see someone else because she went to a prestigious school and worked on high-profile studies of schizophrenia and bipolar patients. And since I was neither of those things, I was a waste of her valuable time. I'm 32 now and was just diagnosed as bipolar type 2 last year. It frustrates me to hell and back thinking that, if only she hadn't wrote me off as a moody teen and had actually paid attention, maybe I could have gotten what I needed so much earlier. I was 20-ish. She was a therapist at my university. She was also a PhD candidate, meaning she couldn't use you in her doctorate thesis. My therapist and I would end every appointment with a discussion of the latest Game of Thrones while it was airing. A great way to end things. Even the poopty end of the show got plenty of light-hearted ribbing. It was great BC, it wasn't too personal, and after talking about intercourse abuse for an hour I could leave without being such a sad sack. Dude, that's awesome. I want your therapist. Even though I don't need one. She's legit a really cool lady and helped me a lot. Plus she had a dog and he was awesome. Past tense only because I also now don't need regular therapy. That's awesome for you. Looks up therapists who watch God with their patients. Honestly, most peeps could do with occasional therapy, even once or twice a year. It's good to know you have a prior relationship if your emotional state goes south, so you don't have to go through the rigmarole of finding someone when you're struggling. If you have insurance, that makes this affordable, and especially know you may have something coming up that could be stressful. It's a gift you give to your future self. Commenting for readers. First time I saw the counselor, he was looking over my paperwork and said he could tell from my handwriting the I was good in bed. I kid you not. I was so caught off guard, all I could say was I think I am. So young and not assertive at all. Found out he got in trouble for an inappropriate relationship with a client. But it really screwed me up for a bit, him saying that because I have problems setting boundaries with men. That counselor is a predator. He took advantage of being in a position of power over a vulnerable person. I hope you've found ways to build healthy boundaries. When my psychologist told me as a 16-year-old that I will never recover and that I should prepare for a struggling life. You serious? That's an awful psychologist. Why did they tell you that? I guess they saw me as a lost case. I remember they said something about me having been through too much traumas and no safety for such a long time that it's impossible for me to ever recover. I didn't want to believe them. I got so mad and decided to prove them wrong. No one tells me what I'm capable of and not accept me kind of attitude. The irony is to hear this as a 16-year-old when life barely has started, became a trauma itself, and it has led me to so much extra struggles. What a terrible psychologist. Yeah, that was my opinion too. Both then and now. Cause even if it would have been true, why the hell do you tell someone suicidal, depressed, traumatized something that totally kills the purpose to live, especially when they're only a teen? My therapist has teared up in sessions with me. My therapist cried at the end of a session once. While crying, she said, "God, you are in so much pain." The next session she profusely apologized for being unprofessional and we moved on. Looking back, I really wish I had the words at the time to tell her how much that meant to me. She was the first person who really validated the pain I was in and made me feel like I was someone worth crying for. Damn. I'm pretty sure this is why none of my doctors are pushing therapy anymore. We all know nothing can help, and I'm fully aware of what bothers me. You can fix people's irrational thoughts, but you can't fix a poop world. One doc said I could try antidepressants, but that since I have perfectly good reasons to be depressed, so they probably won't do much. I was hospitalized a bit ago for trying to kill myself. When you do that in certain places, they can put a mandatory hold on you. I was held for 8 days at a psychiatric unit. It was maybe the most helpful mental health assistance I've ever gotten. I had very insightful, intelligent doctors and counselors. At the end, on my last day as I was leaving, a nurse walked me out of the secure portion of the facility and into a hallway. In the hallway, all of my doctors and counselors had lined up to say goodbye on either side of the hall. As I walked down, my most favorite counselor started singing "Oh Holy Night" for some reason, and IDKY, but I really loved it. Those doctors and counselors were so relatable and down to earth, and I felt so awful when I got there, and I was so much better when I left. Take or leave the Jesus bits. It's a very uplifting song. Musical note, a thrill of hope, a weary world rejoicing. For yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. Musical note, your story made me warm inside. I hope you're doing well. I am doing much better than I was when I was hospitalized. My stay actually did help me a lot, and I was fortunate enough to have a competent and caring team of doctors. I know that isn't always the case, and it definitely hasn't always been the case for me. My exit from the facility is now one of my favorite memories. It feels very much like the day I got a new lease on life. Wishing you lots of happiness, great health and strength. You definitely got a second chance at life. My physiologist, this was when I was 9, went up to my mother, in front of 10 people, and told her I was F-ed and there was nothing he could do, so she might as well kill me. He said this in front of me, my sister, my only friend, who then moved, my grandmother, my grandfather, and 6 strangers. I was, and still am, in therapy for watching my uncle die right in front of me. Heart attack, my suicidal depression, schizophrenia, and anxiety disorder. I think I am fricked. Not gonna lie, I've noticed a trend of messed up therapists here. I'm sorry you had to hear that. I would bet it's not true. That man should not be employed. At the beginning of the session we introduced ourselves, and then I proceeded to talk about my increasingly difficult battle with depression. I got a little emotional, but after almost 3/4 of an hour he asked me if I remembered his name. For the life of me I couldn't, and it just totally baffled me, as I almost pride myself in being polite and remembering things like that. But why would he ask that? Was he trying to figure out if you had a different condition? Long shot. But maybe he was testing for memory, concentration, attention symptoms by asking. Those are very common with clinical depression. Psychologist of 25 years here, and I'm appalled at the bad behavior experienced by clients replying to this thread. My nurse practitioner did exactly that when I went to her, first time, for antidepressants. It was her go-to question 5-10 minutes into any depression discussion with new patients. She said, small town nurse practitioner in Texas, and she was really great at keeping my meds adjusted correctly. I got lucky. Med student here who has seen some patients in psychiatry. Things admitted to me by patients: a bleach drinking addiction, murder, many details of many suicide attempts, many conspiracies about the world, how we're about to be nuked, plans to murder people, often high up government officials or once my classmates. Every time a complex patient opens up about their past, it was always childhood abuse, and no matter how many times I hear it, I'm never ready. I'm sure the professional emotional barrier psychologists are supposed to have comes with experience. I don't blame you for being unprepared. Not many people would be. Professional emotional barrier. This only exists for a little while. Therapists and healthcare providers absolutely need therapy. I had been suicidal every day for over a year. When I was 14/15 I started seeing my first therapist. After a few sessions she told me I was too happy to be in therapy and kicked me out. And it messed me up a lot, lol. My psychologist's jaw dropped to the floor when I explained why a good percentage of my body was always covered in scars or bandages. It was from a mix of self-harm and from other miscellaneous things having caused a lot of harm to me. He ended up writing it all down and it totaled to a 2-page list. The majority of it was things like broken ribs from having an aluminium canoe thrown at me when I was 4 and having been stabbed repeatedly with a Bowie knife. This caught him off guard because I apparently always seemed unnervingly calm to him and didn't outwardly show any signs of significant childhood injuries, and due to one of my hobbies being boxing, I've seen pictures of people with self-harm scars all over their body. It's so surreal even to someone who has self-harmed. Hope you're doing good, man. I'm doing better than I was. I'm glad. Stay safe. As to you, I hope that you have a wonderful day. The moment when the psych looks at you and is trying to figure out if you are lying or not. I'm like, please, we haven't even got to college yet, let's wait for the really messed up poop to happen. What did you say? Just my abandonment issues, daddy issue and trust issues. Also how bad I am at friends and relationships. I'm sure all things they've heard before though. No? Probably a good storyteller. One of the more interesting sessions I've had with my therapist was getting into a tangential argument about philosophy. I don't mean clinically relevant philosophical questions like why should I keep on living. I mean we started bickering over our interpretations of St. Augustine of Hippo or something. I can't remember who we actually started arguing about off the top of my head, but it was pretty funny in retrospect. I quite like her and I'm still seeing her today. Already wrote about this in a different thread, but when the marriage counselor told my then husband and I that we were too hard to work with and she couldn't see us anymore, she fired us from her practice. She didn't make us a referral to someone else either. Similar, when the marriage counselor asked to speak with me alone, to warn me that my then husband had displayed so many worrying signs of narcissism and character disorder during the one session that she worried for me and my infant daughter. The counselor agreed to see me a few more times but refused to see the husband. Was she right about him? Yes. It took me 4 more months to gather the courage to leave him, and it was only then that the full scope of his true nature would rear its ugly head. Everything he did to me during the divorce is the source of my complex PTSD that I'm still working through nearly 6 years later. I see people throw around the word narcissism when really they're exaggerating someone's selfishness. Narcissism is dark and deep and haunting. For anyone who reads this, a warning. If you find yourself in a relationship with a narcissist, get out now. I had a religious therapist once tell me I just needed more water to solve my depression. She concluded this by having me hold out my arms and she tested the strength of each one by pushing down on it and I had to resist against it. Like really? Looking back I should have told her it was BS, but I was so caught off guard I was just like, well okay, I'll have some more water. If only it was that simple. I feel like religious therapists are usually not a great way to go. I feel a sick sense of camaraderie seeing how many child psychologists ducked up other redditors. Jeez. I was 9 or 10. My father left us and my mother tried to commit suicide shortly after. In a session I spoke about being sad my dad left us. Then I was asked, what did it feel like to know your mom tried to leave you forever? I had never framed her suicide attempt that way. I thought she was sick and needed to get better. That session really traumatized me and set me up for years of abandonment issues. Some people should not be allowed around children. I know some of these guys make me lose faith in humanity. There's nothing I can do for you. Your problems are untreatable. I was 11. The honesty is now appreciated. But at the time it was so traumatic that I repressed the memory of hearing that and acted out so horribly that Toronto healthcare people have seen me as the enemy ever since then. As any 11-year would. That's a devastating thing to hear that young. What ended up happening with your problems? Are you any better now? Apparently the problem was borderline personality disorder, for which effective treatments were first found fairly recently. This was way back in 1977 when kids that young were never even diagnosed with borderline. More than a year before that I'd been hit by a car and had emergency head surgery that saved my life. I now recall my personality drastically changing, but apparently that wasn't connected to the accident or the head surgery. In 2010 or 2012 an independent neurologist ordered a head MRI that found subtle ghosts in the white matter of the front left of my brain. Unfortunately the hospital where he ordered a second head MRI with contrast is part of University Health Network, which also owns and operates the children's hospital where I'd had my emergency head surgery decades earlier. I have grave concerns about irregularities intended to avoid legal liability. Frankly, Toronto healthcare treats me like a bother and a nuisance and is just passing the time until my health deteriorates to the point that I quietly pass away. TL. Doctor, I likely have brain damage from a childhood car accident, but there's too much risk of legal liability for investors and Toronto's monopolist of healthcare to let me find out for sure. I've heard of health professionals refusing to treat people with BPD but never a first-hand account. Hopefully it's a trend that's changing. He said, you don't have to forgive someone, especially when they were so cruel and are not sorry. Shocked the hell out of me as any therapist before that tried to get me to forgive, but I can't. I live with it and I don't think forgiving them would bring me any kind of peace. There's a difference between forgiving and moving on. You can't deny what the person did or how it affected you, but you can change how you react in the future to the trigger. There's people I will never forgive in my life, that I refuse to see or even talk about, but that doesn't mean I haven't been able to move on with my life through therapy. My most recent therapist experience lasted for 2 sessions only. Both times, every time if discuss an issue I was having, my therapist would say, OMG me too. Like, I'm here for you, help me. If you're just gonna say that, I can have this conversation in my own. The last session the therapist said, if we met outside of this scenario we'd be really good friends. That was it for me. If I wanted someone to respond with me too when I say I want to die, I'd just go talk to my friends. My mom was a psychiatric nurse, basically a psychiatrist who can't prescribe medication, so she never tells me details, really even being retired, but she had a patient who told her he liked her jacket. One day she comes home on a hot day and then a few days later is asking if we saw her jacket. She thought she had left it at work but couldn't find it. No big whoop. It wasn't a fur coat or anything expensive. A few weeks later she's seeing the patient and right when the patient sits down he goes, oh, I ended up coming back when our session left and your door was unlocked, so I took your jacket. Not the most exciting story, but he did get transferred to a new nurse after that. My mom tells the story better. Edit. Spelling. While I was working at an inpatient facility, I was helping de-escalate a patient who I had a good rapport with. We were sitting in a hallway speaking and he was telling me about the last time he had become that upset. He said, last time I was that angry I stabbed an orderly. Then he looks at me and said, don't worry MRS a-hole, I would never stab you. It definitely threw me off and was probably the most touching thing I have ever heard from a patient. That's actually really sweet. I honestly believe that you can always recover no matter how bad your situation is. A psychologist of all people shouldn't be telling you that you're ducked. I don't want to doubt people's stories, but I have often seen vivid misrepresentations of what goes on at sessions. This doesn't mean people are lying, and it doesn't mean that bad therapists and counselors aren't out there in considerable numbers. One is too high, but it is still a relationship that can be highly complex and interactions that can draw out a high degree of defensiveness, anger, or other problem coping styles. Again, the point of this is not to disparage anyone but to encourage everyone who to seek out help if they need it, and learn about what sort of therapy you are getting. Went to a psychologist when I was probably 13. I had depression, anxiety, and an eating disorder, and they often manifested in bad panic attacks and anger. After seeing him a few times and telling him everything, He brought my parents into the room and proceeded to tell them that I was fine. I was just angry at my parents and seeking attention. I tried protesting and explaining myself, but he refused to listen and tried arguing with me. Needless to say, I never went back there and my parents took me to a new psychologist. It definitely ducked me up a lot, and even thinking about it makes me angry. That's definitely a legit reason to be angry. That's such an invalidating and rude thing to say. I was taking my teenage daughter who was struggling with an eating disorder to a therapist who specialized in that. Even though she was old enough to drive herself, I always took her and waited in the waiting room. Just be supportive for her. To be honest, I didn't think the sessions were helping all that much. But I was at my wit's end trying to help my girl. I knew enough was enough though. When after missing a few sessions due to other commitments, my daughter showed up to her appointment and the therapist greeted her with, "Wow, you look like you've lost some weight," in an approving tone. What the hell? We never went back. What the duck? Did your daughter find a different therapist that was able to help her? I hope she is doing better now. I just described how I tried to kill myself when I was 8. My therapist was crying and had to stop the session. I haven't talked to many people with suicidal thoughts so young. Why did you try to do it at 8 years old? Patient here. I went to a psychologist for a little while for my anxiety and it was clear he wasn't right for me. Much older than I was. Never let me speak. Always changed topics, etc. So I was planning on finding a different person to talk to. But the kicker was when I was talking about my mother and started crying. To preface, he was big on rationality and staying rational, which is an understandable thing if you're trying to help with anxiety, but he did it in all the wrong ways. I started crying, and this grown-ass man looked at me and said something I will never forget with utmost seriousness. "Don't cry. Crying is an irrational response." Went through the rest of the session feeling like poop and never went back. Glad you never went back. Sounds like a pose. Bro, you actually watched the whole video. I'd give you a high five if I was a human. Make sure to click the like button and subscribe for more great content. See you next time.